Minister, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here with you today. Now, the topic that you have asked today, productivity versus sustainability, I think Lars, the Executive Vice President of Yara, has already replied to it. We need to achieve both productivity and sustainability. The Minister has referred to the forthcoming COP27 conference that starts next week. And again, we will hear how important the contribution of agriculture is if we want to have economies that are working within the planetary boundaries. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, agriculture contributes to these developments, and there is no doubt that both in Europe but also on the worldwide level, we have to have a more sustainable agriculture. At the same time, Minister, you have referred to the fact, and FAO figures confirm it, that the level and the number of people that are starving and are suffering from hunger is increasing. And the challenge which we have as a policymaker, how can we, on the one hand, ensure sustainable agricultural production, which normally is perceived as being less productive, with the need of having additional food to the world. That is the challenge. Now, in the European Union, we have made a clear decision. And we think that the way ahead for our society is that we must become more sustainable in all our activities, including agriculture. And the Green Deal and the different strategies that we have developed, one is farm to fork, the other one is biodiversity strategy, really head to a greener common agricultural policy. Now, we are working on two strands when we want to make our agricultural policy more sustainable, but at the same time productive. On the one hand, we are working with incentives for farmers, because do not underestimate the changes which we require from farmers if you want them to produce more sustainable. This is not negligible. They have to change many of their traditions and ways how they have produced food. So we are working with financial incentives, but we are also working with a regulatory framework. Now let me start what we have done in terms of financial support to the common agricultural policy. You might know we have a budget for the next 7 years of about 400 billion euros. Part of this budget is dedicated to ensure that farmers have a safe income, mainly through direct payments, in average about 200 euros per hectare agricultural land under production, but it's hugely dependent on the different member states, to ensure income for farmers. And we are working on a study about the drivers of food security. And there are people that do not remember that the key assurance for food security is farmers. So farmers are a key driver for food security, and better you support them to ensure food security. So I think that's the economic sustainability of our common agricultural policy. But evidently, we have also to address the sustainability in terms of environment, climate, and biodiversity. And here, 40% of the 400 billion euros are dedicated to instruments that should make the common agricultural policy more sustainable. What are these instruments? Certainly some of them are also known to your agricultural policy here in Norway. The support, the direct payment support to farmers is linked to the respect of a minimum of good agricultural and environmental conditions. You only receive the full funding of direct payments if you respect key conditions in terms of greener common agricultural policy. For example, you have to rotate your yields. You have to put aside land for nature restoration, for biodiversity. So this is one category of support which we are providing to enforce our green agenda. And on the other hand, we are supporting farmers that do more than the legal requirements would ask them to do through so-called eco schemes and agri-environmental measures. So I'm convinced that the new common agricultural policy, which we put in place at the moment that I'm speaking, because we are approving the so-called national strategic plans of all member states, who now translate these requests in terms of environmental, climate, and biodiversity challenges into their legislation. Again, this is asking a lot from our farmers' community, but this is what we need to do to render our policy more sustainable. At the same time, and that is an issue that is presently under discussion, we are also advancing on a legislative agenda, where we are asking, not necessarily from the agricultural side, but from environment, from public health side, farmers to do more in terms of giving land back to nature, in terms of biodiversity, to reduce pesticides in terms of pesticide reduction, but also in terms of other emissions. And it is true that now stakeholders who, after the proposals of the European Commission, are supposed to deal with these items, do have a very careful look at these legislative proposals, because some of them feel that in times of crisis, there are limits of what you can ask farmers in terms of additional efforts to provide sustainability. So indeed, we are facing now, with respect to these initiatives, some questions relating to, have you considered what the impact of these proposals is on food security? There is an element which I think is quite decisive in our discussions. We are discussing this issue of productivity versus sustainability. And there are many voices, and I think I've heard it also here today, that in principle there is sufficient food, but it's in the wrong places, it's not well distributed. And when we are discussing about food security, I hear voices that say, yeah, but on the other hand, there is so much food loss. We could change our consumer behavior. We could eat more balanced diets, which would address some of the challenges which we are facing in terms of food security. And we could use new technologies, breeding techniques, to produce more. I think all this is right and has the potential to address the productivity issue. But I think we also need to be aware, and you have talked about this, it requires speed. I've been working in research and innovation before, and one of the key challenges is indeed the deployment of research and innovation until each and every farmer across the world uses these new findings. And this takes time. So the same is true for food loss. How many times have we tried, or since when do we try to address this? It takes time. The same for changes in consumer behavior. Today, 58% of Europeans are eating animal proteins. Now, in terms of having a more balanced diet, we should change this. But again, it will take time. So I think we have all the tools to ensure that our more sustainable production will also provide sufficient and appropriate food. But there is a transition, I think, which we have to cover well. And that brings me to the question, what does the European Commission do now to address the very difficult situation in which we are facing now? So my message is very clear. There is no alternative to having more sustainable agricultural production. The biggest enemy for farming and for food production is indeed climate change and loss of biodiversity. So I think we have to address it. But as I indicated, we are, at the moment that we are sitting here, we have an issue of food security. Last year or this year, the discussion was that we are missing 25 million tons of wheat from Ukraine. Who is coming in to provide these 25 million tons? The time it takes to have the food loss addressed, the time it takes to have the new techniques in place, might not be at this very moment. So how did we react in the European Commission? Firstly, I think it is very clear that the question of food security is not necessarily an issue of the European Union. I think thanks to our farmers, to our policy, to the single market, we have sufficient food for our citizens. Also, there is an issue of affordability. We have an inflation rate of about 15% in food production. But I think it's not only about food security in Europe. Europe has also a global role to play, or a global responsibility in terms of worldwide food security. And there I would fully agree with the minister that the key objective and target which we need to address is resilience of farming across the world, in all places. This requires all our efforts in terms of support, financial support, support in terms of research and innovation, in making available best practices and so on. And I think there things become already more complicated. It also requires humanitarian support because they are starving now. So you have to provide food to the rest of the world. And here the question evidently comes also in about providing financial support to these countries. Now, I think on the global side, we are working on these elements, and I can't just agree then with the minister that multilateral efforts are widespread from the United Nations over the COP27, over OECD. Everybody deals with these issues of food security, but cooperation has become more complicated. But the issues are resilience and humanitarian support. Now, what did we do for Europe? And I think here partly these are measures which I understand are also known to the Norwegian agricultural policy. Firstly, it is about supporting farmers for the increased input prices in terms of energy, in terms of fertilizer. And I think we have taken crisis measures in this respect, but we have also addressed the possibility that member states might provide state aid to farmers, but also to the, in particular, fertilizer producing industry. The point that we are working, on which we are presently working, is indeed, as you have indicated, is the situation with respect to fertilizer, where the Commission has committed itself to come forward with a communication on the 9th November, which will look at these different elements, how we can address globally, but also within the European Union, the question of shortages of availability of fertilizer. In the short term, evidently also the question arises, have we exploited all the possibilities to produce food in Europe? And there immediately you are in a kind of difficult situation, because if you further increase your productivity potential, this might be in contradiction to other policy objectives, in particular relating to sustainability. And in terms of short-term measures, you remember that the European Commission has decided this summer that one element of the CAP reform, which is to put aside agricultural land for reasons of biodiversity, should be put on hold for 1 year to ensure, in particular, production of wheat. Now, this gives you an example of these difficult trade-offs in the short term between, on the one hand, producing food, and on the other hand, of respecting biodiversity. I think it's difficult to discuss or judge such policy decisions, whether they are right or wrong. They are extremely difficult, they are extremely complicated, and I think it's also a sign of a democratic society at the end that we are able, even in terms of crisis, to look at different trade-offs which, in terms of policy making, are necessary here and then. It's also true that we should not abuse the situation, the difficult situation in terms of agriculture production and food security, to make easy gains, to delay reforms, to do the necessary things which we are supposed to do. I think that is a point where we have to be extremely careful, and we need to be committed to our agenda, but at the same time, I think we need to listen carefully to our stakeholders as to what is digestible for them in terms of crisis. So I think this is what I wanted to share with you. From the European Union, from the European Commission, we are convinced that the Green Deal, Farm to Fork and biodiversity are at the core of our policy agenda, and we will continue to work on this agenda. At the same time, we are ready to listen and to look at challenges that the world is facing, but also our stakeholders are facing. Thank you very much.